Okay, let's unpack this.
All right.
In an age of, well, just constant information overload, it's really tempting to look for shortcuts to understanding complex stuff.
Definitely. Too much noise.
Exactly. So today, we're doing a deep dive into a concept that kind of aims to do just that for democratic discourse. It's called deliberative democracy.
Right. The idea of structured, informed discussion.
Yeah, moving beyond just the shouting matches, hopefully. Emphasizing, civil discussion over just adversarial debate.
But there's a tension there, isn't there?
That's the core thing we want to explore.
Mhm.
Is this a genuinely powerful tool for, say, civic engagement, bridging divides?
Mhm.
Or is it maybe something more problematic?
Mhm.
Our deep dive today, it's primarily based on this really fascinating and sometimes pretty provocative set of excerpts. It's called Nudge Me Harder, Daddy, The Pedagogical Cage of Deliberative Democracy.
Quite a title.
It is, by Chris Abraham. And it offers a really sharp critique, but importantly also thoughtful defense that we'll get into.
Okay, so both sides.
Yep. Our mission is basically to pull out the key nuggets of knowledge, the insights from this material, helping you understand not just what deliberative democracy is, but really what it means for how we think about civic engagement, public discourse, the whole shebang.
Got it. Sounds good.
Okay, so let's dive right into the first big critique Abraham makes, because he uses some really striking imagery.
Right.
He talks about initiatives like Stanford's America in One Room, and he doesn't frame it as true dialogue. He calls it, pretty provocatively, a lab, or even a Skinner box.
Wow, a Skinner box. Like for conditioning pigeons or rats?
Exactly. That's the reference. The author paints this picture.
Hmm.
The voter is the rat, the room is the cage. And the whole experiment is moderated by these, quote, data-driven technocrats with their briefing packets and, chatbots.
Okay.
And the source says, the only way out is to demonstrate you've learned your lesson.
Learned your lesson. How?
Well, for example, by pressing the empathy button, or maybe reconsidering the Medicare slider. Metaphorically speaking, of course.
Mhm.
The door only opens if, and only if, you correctly solve the puzzle of your own irrationality.
That's quite the framing. It's a compelling image, even if it's stark.
It is stark.
And one of the key takeaways here, I think, is what this lens, this behavioral conditioning idea suggests about the underlying assumptions,
Yeah.
about the public.
Yeah, what does it assume?
Well, it implicitly treats citizens as something to be, like, fixed or trained, rather than as folks capable of autonomous reason judgment right from the start.
So it assumes a deficit.
Exactly. A deficit in their ability to think for themselves, essentially. That's the critique being made.
That's a really sharp distinction. And it leads right into Abraham's next big point, doesn't it?
It does.
He pushes it even further. He labels deliberative democracy as, and this is another quote, the liberal managerial class's latest missionary campaign.
Missionary campaign?
Suggesting the pagan babies aren't somewhere overseas, but right here in the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, clutching their Bibles and unapproved opinion.
That's direct.
Very direct. And the mission, according to Abraham's analysis here, is conversion through civil tone and corrective group therapy.
Right. So the core premise that Abraham is critiquing is exactly that. It's all premised, he argues, on the idea that the public, if you just leave them alone, they can't reason properly.
Can't deliberate.
Can't deliberate, can't act in their own interest, not without being re-educated first. Re-educated in the ways of, quote, evidence-based civility. And he cites James Fishkin, who's a key figure in this field. Fishkin apparently said, most citizens don't take the time to become anything like ideal citizens or informed citizens.
Okay, and Abraham sees that quote as sort of proof.
That's capturing that underlying, maybe patronizing attitude. That's the interpretation in the critique.
It's a pretty tough read on
Yeah.
it. Does Abraham explore the idea that maybe some voters are actually misinformed? Or is he just focusing on this perceived arrogance?
Well, the critique leans heavily on the perceived arrogance. Yeah. It frames the approach as reflecting this belief that, look, we didn't fail to connect, you failed to understand.
The classic messaging problem.
Exactly. We didn't get beat, we just need to message better. So in this view, elections become like a test of comprehension.
And if your side loses,
Then the electorate flunked. That's the implication he draws. It basically turns deliberation into a managed conversion ritual, not a real meeting of equals, not a negotiation.
okay, so it's managed. And it's not just about the voters themselves, right? The source also questions the whole process, specifically the claim that it's neutral or ideological.
Right, because the materials are balanced.
Yeah, that's the claim. But the critique argues that neutrality here is a posture, not a position.
What does that mean exactly? A posture and not a position?
It means the underlying assumption, according to Abraham, is that all disagreement comes down to ignorance or, emotional bias, affective bias.
Not genuine differences in values.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not about different worldviews or priorities or deeply held values. You can't just disagree. You must be misinformed. That's the core assumption being critiqued.
Okay, I get it now. And the outcome described then is pretty interesting. Participants apparently move closer together.
Which sounds good on the surface.
Sure, but the argument is that it's not necessarily through genuine compromise. It's because that's the function of the lab. Behavioral convergence.
Behavioral convergence, not democracy.
Not democratic process, not negotiation. It's conditioned alignment.
Conditioned alignment. Wow.
And to really hammer that point home, the source uses this powerful thought experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine the opposite scenario. Imagine a right populist group sets up these deliberative polling rooms.
Okay.
And ordinary voters are brought in and essentially re-educated until they accept that, say, small government, border control, fossil fuels. These are just common sense American values.
Right. The left would absolutely scream indoctrination.
You bet they would. But the critique goes, when Stanford does something analogous in a conference center, using AI moderators and measuring empathy, well, then it gets labeled science.
That comparison really makes you pause, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights the potential double standard in how we perceive these processes depending on who's running them and what the desired outcome is.
So this critique sees the whole thing as, what was the phrase? Technocratic correction.
Yeah, that's it. Starting from the premise that you're broken.
Which sounds pretty paternalistic. But couldn't you argue that sometimes? I mean, if public discourse is genuinely full of misinformation, maybe some correction or guidance is needed.
That's the counter-argument, sure. But the deeper critique here, from Abraham's perspective, is that this approach fundamentally trusts process over people. Meaning, instead of digging into why voters might distrust elites, maybe because of, as the source puts it, a long-earned alienation, it just assumes the distrust itself is the problem that needs solving.
Not seeing the distrust as maybe a symptom of a legitimate problem.
Precisely. It treats people as programmable rather than political. Like cogs to be adjusted, not citizens with agency and history.
Right. And there's that contrast between Fishkin's question and Abraham's counter. Fishkin asks, what would democracy look like if the public were actually informed?
A reasonable question on its face.
Sure. But Abraham flips it. What would democracy look like if the public didn't have to pass a comprehension test to be taken seriously?
Ooh, that's a powerful counter. It shifts the burden, doesn't it?
Completely. So until that changes, this critique concludes, deliberative democracy remains this kind of well-funded escape room where the exit only opens once you say the magic words.
Magic words being the correct conditioned opinions.
That seems to be the implication. It's a powerful, maybe cynical conclusion to that line of argument.
It really is.
But okay, let's take a breath. What if we step back and try a different lens? The source does offer what it calls a strongest charitable read.
The flip side.
Yeah, dubbed the Sommer Gentry POV. And from this perspective, maybe the goal isn't really re-education in that harsh sense.
Okay. What is it then?
Perhaps it's more about de-escalation, just trying to calm the epistemic wildfire that seems to be burning through modern politics.
Epistemic wildfire, I like that phrase. Captures the spread of bad info and hot takes.
It does,
Yeah.
right. So from this angle, maybe people like Fishkin and Diamond, they're not condescending managers. Maybe they're just idealists trying to create some scaffolding for rational pluralism.
Scaffolding. In what the source calls an outrage casino of a media ecosystem.
Exactly, an outrage casino. So in that light, maybe the nudge isn't a leash pulling you where they want. Maybe it's actually a lifeline.
A lifeline in a sea of noise and manipulation. That's a very different framing.
It is, and it connects to that fight fire with fire argument too.
How so?
Well, yes, pedagogy teaching can sometimes feel a bit like programming, like we discussed. But we live in an era where algorithms, targeted ads, psyops, social media timelines designed to maximize dopamine hits, they're already programming us in a way.
That's undeniable. We're constantly being shaped and nudged online.
So maybe it's fair to fight that fire with a different kind of fire. Maybe the idea isn't to strip people's agency, but actually to help them reboot cognitive sovereignty.
Reboot cognitive sovereignty, like help people regain control over their own thinking.
Yeah, in this hyper-stimulated, often deceptive world, if you believe democracy needs some minimum level of informed judgment to function,
Which many would argue it does.
then maybe nudging isn't paternalism, it's triage.
Yeah.
It's emergency care for public discourse.
Triage. That's another powerful word. Okay, connecting this to the bigger picture. The source brings up this provocative idea. What if the U.S. is already kind of undergoing a soft collapse?
A soft collapse, like internally.
Yeah, like a color revolution, but turned inward. If you accept that premise, even tentatively, then maybe these soft power strategies to try and harmonize values to get people on the same page, maybe they aren't sinister plots.
Maybe they're just necessary.
Or at least the lesser evil. The source suggests, nudging people towards reasoned empathy might be better than watching the Republic burn because YouTube radicalized another million people on autoplay.
Wow, that really ups the stakes.
It does. And it leads to this other really provocative thought. Maybe everyone should be treated a bit like minors in the voting booth.
Wait, like children? Because they're dumb.
No, not because they're dumb, but because the world we've built is just too complex, too full of deception, too noisy for our raw instincts alone to navigate safely.
So it's not an insult to intelligence, but an acknowledgement of the environment.
Exactly.
Oh.
The environment is overwhelming our capacity for clear judgment, perhaps. It's a radical thought, but worth considering in this context.
Definitely radical. Yeah. Okay, the source also hits some FAQs, some common questions about this stuff.
Good, let's cover those. Like what?
Well, first, is it just liberal elitism repackaged?
And the answer?
The source says, pretty bluntly, arguably yes. But, of course, proponents have other names for it. They call it structured pluralism or evidence-based civic scaffolding.
Different labels for potentially the same thing, depending on your view. Okay, what else?
How about this? Is forcing people into a process to change their minds undemocratic?
That seems like a core objection.
It is. Advocates push back, saying it's voluntary deep listening, not actual force. People choose to participate.
Voluntary. But the environment is still structured to lead somewhere.
That's the tension. And then the big one. How is this different from propaganda?
Yeah, the indoctrination question again.
The typical answer given is that propaganda tells you what to think. Deliberation, ideally, teaches you how to think.
Ideally.
But the source adds, it undeniably walks a fine line.
That seems fair, a very fine line. And thinking about this historically helps broaden the view too, right?
Definitely. The source asks us to consider, how does this fit into a bigger historical narrative?
And it suggests
a kind of same playbook, different decade situation.
Oh, like connecting it to earlier efforts, drawing lines from the New Deal to the war on poverty and now to the, quote, war on misinformation. Similar impulses to guide or correct the public, perhaps.
Interesting parallel.
And it notes that post-Obama, the stakes somehow felt more moralized. It wasn't just, let's talk it out. It became more like, you're on the wrong side of history.
Which raises the temperature considerably.
For sure. And we see similar structures elsewhere, right? Like the UK and European citizens' assemblies.
Yeah, the source mentions those, often with maybe looser controls than some US models. The EU version is described as potentially more technocratic, less evangelical in its tone.
Okay. And then the source takes a pretty extreme historical turn for comparison.
Uh-oh, where does it go?
It brings up China's Cultural Revolution and even Stalinist purges.
Whoa, okay. That needs major qualification, right? They're not saying these workshops are gulags.
Absolutely not. Let's be crystal clear. The source is not drawing a direct equivalence or implying anything like state terror.
So what's the point of bringing them up?
It's about identifying a shared piece of, let's call it DNA, an underlying impulse. The drive for the collective must be aligned.
That desire for uniformity of thought.
Exactly. And the argument is that this impulse, in a subtle way, haunts even our gentle civic workshops. It's presented as a stark warning, a reminder of a potential slippery slope.
From empathy training.
Towards something closer to ideological purification if we're not extremely careful about power, control, and genuine dissent.
Okay. That's a heavy thought to end the historical context on.
It is. It's meant to be cautionary.
So after all that, what does this mean for you listening right now, just trying to stay well-informed in this crazy environment?
Yeah. What's the takeaway?
Well, we've seen deliberative democracy framed in two really starkly different ways, haven't we?
Definitely.
On one hand, a sophisticated, maybe even necessary approach to try and de-escalate political discourse, to build bridges.
The lifeline view.
Right. And on the other, as this paternalistic pedagogical cage, designed basically to correct people, not to truly collaborate with them.
The Skinner box or missionary view.
Exactly. So hopefully this deep dive has given you a much more nuanced look at the motivations behind it, the mechanics of how it works, and importantly, the potential pitfalls. It lets you see beyond just the surface claims.
Yeah, and that final quote from the source really sticks with you, doesn't it? Consensus without chaos isn't democracy. It's compliance with better manners.
Oof. That's the mic drop, all right.
It really is. And it forces us to grapple with this fundamental question. What is democracy, really? Is its vitality found in that kind of controlled harmony, that polite compliance?
Or does it actually need a certain amount of messiness,
Yeah.
a level of genuine unmanaged disagreement, maybe even chaos, to truly thrive?
That's the question. What is that appropriate level of chaos? And how do we make sure genuine deliberation can happen, can flourish?
Without falling into just total polarization on one side.
Or slipping into this kind of enforced conformity, this compliance with better manners on the other. It's a huge balancing act.
It really is.
Yeah.
So maybe the final thought for you to mull over is just that.
Yeah.
After hearing all these perspectives, what's your take? Where do you draw that crucial line between helpful guidance and maybe subtle conditioning when it comes to our public conversations?